In 2017, 27-year-old Lydia Makarchuk left her home country of Ukraine and moved to Bracknell, which is a town just outside of London. Shortly after moving into her new apartment, Lydia went out and got a job as an accountant at a local hotel, and then after that, Lydia pretty much swore off her social life and instead just focused exclusively on working hard and saving money. The one reprieve she got from work was going to church on Sundays. 2 years later, Lydia was at her church enjoying the coffee hour that always followed the Sunday sermon when another member of her church, who she didn't really speak to, this 41-year-old man named Norbert Varga, approached her and kind of awkwardly complimented her shoes. And she was so flattered by this that it opened up a friendly conversation between the two of them. And during this conversation, Lydia was pleasantly surprised to find out that Norbert was an expat too. An expat is someone who lives outside of their native country. Norbert had moved to the UK in 2018, so that's 1 year after Lydia had moved to the UK, and he came from Hungary, which shares a border with Ukraine. And just like Lydia, when he got to the UK, he kind of put all his energy into his work and trying to save money. He was a radio technician and a photographer. And so the two spend the rest of this coffee hour chatting and enjoying each other's company. And then afterwards, when they left the church and they both got home, they both found themselves thinking about the other. There was clearly an attraction there. And so the following Sunday, they both very eagerly rushed back to church in order to spend more time together. And sure enough, during that coffee hour, they spent the whole time together just chatting it up, and then afterwards they exchanged phone numbers and made plans to get together outside of church. They were going to go on a date. And so the rest, as they say, is history. 2 years after Norbert complimented Lydia's shoes, they got married in Bracknell. And while the wedding was great, unfortunately none of Lydia's family members, who were all in Ukraine, none of them could attend the actual wedding. And so the newlywed couple decided the way they would handle that is their honeymoon would be spent in Ukraine. That way Lydia's family could celebrate their wedding as well. For a variety of reasons, this honeymoon trip to Ukraine kept getting pushed back, but finally in September of 2021, everything lined up, everyone was available, and so Norbert and Lydia rushed to the airport and they hopped on a flight. And during this flight to Ukraine, Lydia remembers being so excited specifically about her husband finally getting a chance to spend some time with her 29-year-old younger brother Miroslav. Lydia was very close with her brother, and so it mattered to her greatly that he and her husband had a good relationship. But to that point, because of the great physical distance between the UK and Ukraine, the two had really not had that much interaction, and so they really didn't know each other very well. And so this trip was really important to Lydia, and Miroslav, he really picked up on that because he put together this camping trip for the end of their stay in Ukraine, where he knew he'd be able to step aside with Norbert and chat with him and get to know him a little bit. And so that was kind of like the fail-safe, where if he and Norbert did not get a chance to speak all week because they were visiting with so many people, they would have a chance to at the end of the week on this camping trip. So after a few hours of flying, Lydia and Norbert touch down in Ukraine, and they make their way to Lydia's family's house where they're going to be staying for the week. And that night, and for the next several days, the couple was swamped with several family reunions and meetups with old friends that hadn't seen Lydia in years. And so Norbert and Miroslav were not getting any time to themselves. And Lydia really knew that. And so she and Norbert began looking forward to this camping trip because that not only represented a kind of peaceful break from the chaos of all these reunions, but it also did represent the one chance they knew Miroslav and Norbert would get to interact with each other. And so finally, September 15th, the end of the week, it came, and it was time to go on this camping trip. And so Lydia and Norbert and Miroslav and 9 other family members, they all packed up their tents and their camping belongings, and they loaded up a couple of cars, and they drove over to the base of the Carpathian mountain range. This mountain range, which stretches for nearly 1,000 miles across Eastern and Central Europe, are very popular amongst tourists because it's stunningly beautiful. Everything is green and lush, and there are these crystal clear lakes and breathtaking waterfalls and all these amazing animals running around, and there's no mosquitoes, and they have these really cool hikes that bring you up to these very impressive overlooks. And so that night, Miroslav had made reservations for this one campsite campsite, this very popular campsite that was up in this clearing, not too far up the mountain, and it had this great view down to the forest below, and because it was in a clearing, it had this unobstructed view up to the sky, where in this area, you could look up and just see stars in every direction. And so when Lydia and the rest of this group arrive in the parking lot of this mountain range, they were all really excited to get up to this campsite and just enjoy being there. And so they park their cars, they get their gear out, they find the trailhead, and then they begin hiking up the mountain. And about 2 hours later, they arrive at this clearing. They find their campsite, which was marked by this small fire pit underneath a couple of trees. And so they go over and they set their tents up, and some people go out and get some firewood. And then before long, a fire was made, and this group of 12 people that had not seen each other in so long, they just sat down and began enjoying each other's company. They put tea on, they were swapping stories. It was really just this wonderful time. And then around 8 p.m., the sun started to set, at which point this huge group just stopped and enjoyed this beautiful sunset. And then once the sun had gone down, there were 2 kids that were there on this trip. And so they were put to bed in their tent. And then the remaining 10 adults just kind of hung out by the fire and enjoyed each other's company. And it was actually during this second half of the night that Norbert and Miroslav finally really got a chance to just chat with each other. So for about an hour, they were talking to each other, and Lydia is just watching this happen, and she couldn't be happier. This is like the perfect ending to this trip. And then around 9 p.m., Norbert stands up. Lydia sees him stand up, and he tells the group he's going to run back to his tent, which was a ways away from the campfire, and he was going to get his camera. And so Lydia said, okay, no problem. And she remembers watching him walk off into the distance, because when you're at the campfire, if you're looking away from the campfire, everything is pitch black in that direction. And so she watches him disappear into the darkness, and then she and her brother and everyone else just kind of turn back towards the campfire. And then all she remembers about what happens next is she heard a whistling sound. And at first it was very faint, but it started to get very, very loud. And when it got loud, she tried to kind of figure out where it was. But before she could, suddenly something hit her in the face, predominantly hit her in the nose. And as soon as it did, she went blind, she went deaf, and then she felt herself on the ground, and she has no idea what's going on. And all she can remember thinking is, oh my God, something horrible has happened to me. I might die. I don't know what's happening, but I might die. And so she started praying for herself to survive whatever was happening to her. And then her hearing started to come back just a little bit. Her vision was still totally blurred. She could only kind of tell where the fire was because it was bright, but her hearing, it started to come back. And that's when she heard moaning coming from somewhere near her. And so she's thinking, okay, whatever horrible thing has happened to me has happened to other people too. And so instead of just praying for herself, she began praying for everyone who was at this campsite. And so as her hearing is getting louder and louder, and she's hearing more and more moaning and crying happening all around her, she suddenly hears her husband screaming her name. Her vision is still gone, but she knows it's him, and he lands right behind her and he grabs her and he's just repeating her name over and over and over again. And then Lydia manages to kind of choke out to her husband, what happened? And there's a pause, and then Norbert says to her, it's bad. It's really bad. It would turn out their campsite was on a battlefield from World War I, and buried underneath the soil right under their fire pit was an unexploded bomb from World War I. Meaning, for over 100 years, countless campers have arrived at this campsite and lit fires on top of this bomb that they couldn't see. And each fire gradually eroded the outer metal casing of this explosive until finally that night in September, with Lydia and 11 of her loved ones nearby, their little fire finally was it. It pushed through that last little bit of the casing and it ignited the bomb and it detonated. That whistling that she heard was the sound of the fire finally cutting through that casing and being exposed to the fire. And then that thing that struck her in the face, that hit her right on the nose, that was almost certainly a piece of the bomb itself. So shrapnel that was cutting through her face. And then the moaning she heard was primarily her brother, who was right next to her. Lydia would be gravely wounded, but she would survive. As for her brother and another man who was not named, they would not survive. Here is a picture that was taken of the group literally minutes before this bomb detonated. At 11:40 a.m. on December 21st, 2003, 3 young men who were longtime childhood friends hopped in a truck and began traveling south. They were 22-year-old Brett Mann and 19-year-olds Sean Blowers and Ashley McGuff. They lived in a coastal city called Darwin, which is actually the capital of the Northern Territory in Australia. The Northern Territory, also known as the Top End, is located in the central north of the continent. It is 6 times larger than the UK, but has 280 times less people living in it. Specifically, the UK is home to roughly 70 million people, whereas the Top End is home to only 250,000 people, and half of them live in Darwin. There are many reasons why the Top End is so underpopulated, ranging from politics to poor infrastructure, but the most obvious reason that so few people choose to live in this part of Australia is because it is wildly rugged and dangerous. It is scorchingly hot year-round, and the weather in general is just unbelievably unpredictable and violent. And as the old saying goes, all the animals there are trying to kill you and each other. But Brett, Sean, and Ashley had grown up in Darwin, and so they were accustomed to the hazards of living in the Top End, and so they weren't really concerned about them. What they were concerned with was finding things to do and not getting bored in the city. That particular day, in order to ward off boredom, the trio had decided they would head out to a salt flat that was located about 50 miles to the southwest of Darwin. It was this wide open plain that they could just race around on their quad bikes on. And so they loaded these quad bikes into their trailer, attached it to their truck, they hopped in their truck, and at 11:40 a.m. they started heading south out of Darwin. The first road they were on was this fairly desolate dirt road that wound around through the wilderness, and it passed by the iconic eucalyptus trees that are very well known in Australia. It passed by palm trees and giant termite mounds. And after driving on this dirt road for about 30 minutes, the trio passed by the Tumbling Waters Holiday Park, which is a vacation resort for adventurous families. And then beyond this park, there really was no more civilization. They were headed right into the outback of Australia. And so this was kind of like the last mark of civilization. And so the trio, they drive for another 30 minutes past the park. And at some point, all of the trees on either side of the road start getting more and more dense until they begin kind of encroaching over the road, as if it looks like you're driving directly through the heart of a jungle. And they would have recognized this change in scenery as meaning they were nearing the Finnis River, which was off to their right beyond all of the trees. So they couldn't see it, but they knew they were close. And the Finnis River was not a huge waterway. It was a 30-mile stretch that ran east to west through the Top End. And what it was known for was being very brackish and dark. You could not see into this water more than maybe an inch or two. So it almost appeared black. And so the trio continued driving along through this kind of jungle atmosphere until the left side of the road began to thin out again, and then it eventually revealed the salt flats up to their left. And so at that point, the trio pulled off on the right side of the road where the vegetation was still very thick. And then the trio hopped out of the truck, they went around to their trailer, they dropped the gate, and one by one they pulled their quad bikes off, and then each of them hopped on and drove out onto the flats. That day, the flats were actually very muddy because it had recently rained really, really heavy in that area. And so the trio spent just as much time racing each other on the flats as they did trying to drive close to each other and spray mud on each other. And so for hours they were out there having a great time, and then at 4:30 p.m. they decided it was time to call it a day. And so they drove back over to the truck, they drove their quad bikes up onto the trailer, they locked it, and then they were about to get into the truck to head back home when one of them suggested, hey, let's head down to the water and rinse our clothes off and get all this mud off of us. Now, you need to understand, in the Top End, the place you want to spend the least amount of time in is the water. People in the Top End assume that in any natural water body that is not clearly designated as a swimming area has at least one animal lurking in it that will kill you. This is a literal precaution people in the Top End take. And so this section of the Finnis River that these three friends were thinking about going and jumping into and washing off inside of, this was not a clearly designated swimming area, and so it should be avoided. But you need to remember, these three guys, they grew up in the Top End. They were used to living in this kind of wild area, and they'd also come to the salt flats so many times over the years, and they had jumped into the Finniss River before to wash off and go swimming, and nothing had ever happened. And so really the idea that the Finniss River could be dangerous to them, it didn't really cross their mind. They felt like, you know what, we've been there, done that. Nothing's going to happen to us. And so they left the truck and walked away from the salt flats into this mangrove forest that's only a couple of feet off the road and began walking towards this river. Normally, the trip from the road through the forest to the river bank, basically where the forest ended and you reach the river, it would take about 10 minutes. But after walking in this mangrove for maybe a minute, they were already standing in river water. It was only a couple of inches of this water, but it signaled to the guys that clearly the river is very swollen from all of the recent rains, enough so that it overflowed beyond its natural boundaries and it's flooded the mangrove forest. But the three guys, they look at each other and think, meh, what's the big deal? I'm sure we'll be fine. And so the guys continued moving on, but as the mangroves began to thin out, they began to slow down dramatically because the riverbanks on the edges of the Finniss River were very, very steep. If you were standing on dry land, if there was no flooding, and you were right on the edge of the Finniss River, if you took even 1 or 2 steps into the river, you would slip down under the water and the water would be over your head. Now, as these guys are walking, because the ground is flooded with this black, brackish water, they couldn't see the ground, and so they couldn't tell where the drop-off into the river was. And so they began to slow down, and then when all the trees were practically gone, they knew they were close, and then one of them actually slipped and kind of tumbled down the edge for a second, but he turned and he grabbed one of the roots of the mangrove tree and pulled himself back up. And then the other two, after seeing this, they walked over and stood next to him, and the trio just stood there looking out at this pitch black looking river that was very clearly moving faster than normal because of all this excess rain. But they kind of looked at each other and thought, you know what, it's not that big of a deal. You know, we'll hold on to the roots of these mangroves and lower ourselves over the embankment. We'll wash ourselves off, pull ourselves back up. No big deal. And so they each turned around and grabbed a root of one of the many mangrove trees that marked the edge of this forest. And while holding on, they would lower their lower half down past the embankment until they were submerged. They rubbed all the mud off of themselves, being very careful not to let go of the mangrove at any point. And then as they were about to finish up and pull themselves back up and get back to their truck, Brett loses his balance and somehow lets go of the mangrove root and slips down the steep embankment, and suddenly the current takes him away from his friends and out to the middle of this river, and before long he's getting pulled downstream. And so he yells out to Ashley and Sean, who had their backs turned to him. They turn around, they see their friend, and they instinctively leap into the river to try to go get him and help swim him back to the side. Now, all three of them were very competent swimmers, and so this was not a high panic situation. This was more like a inconvenience and maybe a little bit funny, and so that's why they leapt in no problem. They figured, you know, worst case scenario is we'll drift somewhere down there and we'll get out and we'll walk our way back to our car. But as soon as Sean and Ashley were free floating in this river, they felt how strong this current was, and it was way stronger than they were anticipating. And so they actually started to get a little bit worried, and they looked up ahead of them, and Brett, who had been in the water for, 10 or 15 seconds before they leapt in, he had already moved way farther downstream than them. And so they decided, you know what, we have to get out, but we need to get to Brett first. We all need to get out at the same place. And so they decide they're going to swim downstream, meet up with Brett, and then get the heck out of that river as fast as they possibly can. And so they yell out to Brett to, hey, we're coming to get you. And they start swimming as fast as they possibly can. And with the help of the current, they manage to get all the way up to Brett relatively quickly, maybe a couple of minutes. And when they reach him, Sean and Ashley go in front of Brett. And then the three of them, they stop actively swimming and they allow the current to just kind of carry them downstream. And as they're drifting, they begin scouting the left side of the river for a solid clump of mangrove trees they can swim into, because unless there's something to grab onto on the edge of this river, they can't pull themselves out. And so at this point, the trio is definitely uncomfortable being in the water because of how strong that current is, but they're confident they're going to find a viable landing spot and they're going to get out of here and it will be a great story. And so Sean is in the front, Ashley is right behind him, and then Brett is behind Ashley. And they're they're all about an arm's length away from each other. And they're drifting down this river for a couple of minutes. They're looking on the left side for a viable landing spot. And then all of a sudden, Ashley just yells out, "Hey, I see something in the water. We need to get out. Find the nearest tree. Get out, get out, get out." And so Sean, he starts panicking. He doesn't even turn around to see what's going on behind him. Adrenaline kicks in and he swims as fast as he possibly can to a tree that's popped out of the river. It's literally growing in the middle of the river. And so he swims up to this tree. He manages to climb up to the first fork of the tree, which is maybe 6 or 8 feet above the water. And as soon as he's up there, he turns around and looks down and he sees Ashley. He reaches down and he hoists Ashley up to the first fork with him. And then the pair turn around again to grab Brett, but Brett's not there. And so they look around, they're thinking, okay, did Brett not make it to the tree? Did the current pull him around? Is he at some other tree? You know, they're yelling out for him, they're looking for him, but there's no Brett. And so they're talking to each other, Ashley and Sean. They're saying, hey, did he call out? Did you hear something? Did he give some indication about where he was going? And they're saying, no, I don't know where he is. And so they start climbing up the tree a little bit and trying to look down and up the river to see if maybe they can see him. And then all of a sudden, Sean notices something yellow flash beneath them in the water. And so he looks straight down and he sees this yellow thing down there. And so he nudges Ashley and he says, look. And so Ashley looks down, and as they're looking, they're about 10 feet off the water at this point. They see this yellow thing start rising up to the surface. Now the water is so dark, they really can't tell what anything is unless it is at the surface. And so they're watching this yellow thing, and suddenly it comes out of the water and they see it's Brett. He's got his yellow jacket on. That's what they saw. And Brett is in the mouth of a 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. He is face down and his left side is being held in this animal's mouth, and he's not moving. And so Sean and Ashley are so scared, they're just frozen. They're just staring at this monster that's in the water, that's holding their friend underwater, and they can't do anything about it. And for 2 minutes, they just stand there looking at this animal, wondering what's going to happen. And for those entire 2 minutes, the crocodile stared right back up at Ashley and Sean, as if it was showing them what it was going to do to them once they got in the water. That I've done this to your friend, I'm getting you to as well. And so they're staring at this animal when suddenly it just kind of goes underneath the water back down into the black abyss, and it, along with Brett, just disappear. Ashley and Sean are so terrified that they can't even grieve for their friend. They can't feel sad for him. It's like they just go into survival mode. And without saying anything to each other, they just start climbing up this tree as fast and as far as they possibly can. And they only manage to get up maybe a couple more feet to 2 more branches. One's at about 10 or 12 feet off the water, and the other is at about 15 feet off the water. And so Sean makes it onto the lower branch, and then Ashley makes it onto the slightly higher branch. And then once they're situated on their branch and one arm is firmly wrapped around the trunk of the tree, they're able to kind of breathe for a second and take stock of their situation. And even though, of course, the elephant in the room here is that their friend was just eaten by a crocodile, but it's like they can't process that yet. Instead, they start talking about, okay, well, our families, they're going to recognize our absence, and they're going to tell the police, and the police are going to launch a search, and they're going to come find us. Both of them were confident, or they acted confident, that that was going to happen, but they also knew that there was no timeline for this. It could be hours or days until this actually happened. And so as these two teens are sitting on their branches, the reality of their situation really started to come crashing down on them. Because yeah, they're safe in this tree, but how long can they possibly stay in this tree for? I mean, eventually they're going to need to fall asleep. And if they fall asleep, are they going to fall out of the tree and land in the water with this crocodile? I mean, they just didn't know how this was going to turn out. And so as the two began comforting each other, you know, reassuring each other that, oh no, it's going to be just fine. Someone's going to find us tonight or tomorrow. We'll be just fine. As they're doing that, Ashley suddenly stops talking to Sean and just looks straight down. And so Sean realizes what Ashley's doing, and he matches his gaze. And he looks straight down, and at the base of their tree, in that black water, is the 13-foot long saltwater crocodile. It's back, and it no longer has Brett in its mouth. They have no idea where Brett is. He's just gone. Saltwater crocodiles are considered the most aggressive and dangerous crocodiles in the world. And they are one of only 2 crocodile species that will actively hunt humans when given a chance. And so these 2 teens are helpless in this tree. All they have is some separation from the black water and this animal down below. And so they just find themselves staring straight down at this crocodile. And in turn, this crocodile just stares right back up at them. It's very clearly waiting for them. It wants them to come out of the tree so it can eat them. And so the crocodile just continuously repositions itself all around the tree. It's just keeping the top of its head out of the water so its eyes can look up at them. And so the teens are just praying that at some point it will grow tired of them and will leave. And after several hours, right as the sun is about to set, this crocodile does seem to give up on them, and it drifts under the water and disappears. After a couple of minutes, Sean, who was on the slightly lower branch, decides he doesn't want to be any closer to the water than he needs to be, and he's going to climb up to Ashley's branch. And so he very carefully stands up on his branch. He makes sure he's got solid footing, and then he reaches up and he grabs a branch with his right hand, and he kind of tests it, and he feels like it's pretty sturdy, and then he puts all his weight on it and tries to reach for another branch when this one breaks. And as soon as that branch broke, Sean tumbled 10 feet into the water. And so he hits the water, he goes all the way under, he sinks a few feet under, and immediately he's turned around and he's trying to swim as fast as he can to the surface, and he's just expecting at any moment this crocodile is going to bite him. He gets to the surface and he looks around. It's a little bit dark, but he can immediately see his tree, and he realizes the current has pulled him away from his tree. And so in a panic, he starts swimming and kicking his legs as hard as he possibly can to get back to this tree. And he knows the whole time he's kicking his legs, he's just attracting the attention of this crocodile, but he's got nothing else he can do. He's got no other tree he can reasonably get to that will provide safety from this animal. And so with every ounce of energy he's got, he kicks and swims, and finally he manages to grab a root of this tree that his friend is still inside of, and he begins pulling himself with his lower half still submerged in the water. And so as he's dragging himself towards the trunk of this tree, he's just waiting for this crocodile to bite down on his legs, and finally he gets to the trunk of the tree and he's able to pull his body out of the water, and he clambers up to that original branch he was on, and then he and Ashley work to get him up to Ashley's branch. And as soon as he sits down next to Ashley and he's secure, they both look down, and just a little ways away from the tree, basically in the area where Sean had just landed in the water, they see with the little light that is left, this crocodile swimming right back over to the tree, and it camps out right underneath. Sean had gotten out just in time. When the sun finally did set about 10 or 15 minutes later, it became pitch black. There's no ambient light in this part of the world. There aren't any buildings or cities close enough to this area, and so it is truly pitch black. And so they could no longer see the crocodile down below. But they knew it was there because periodically they would hear it repositioning itself right underneath them. Also, because it was so dark, the two teens could not actually see each other. And so they began holding on to each other, and then anytime either of them moved, they would announce their movement to the other, just so they knew they had not fallen asleep and were not falling out of the tree to a horrible death. And so a few hours went by like this, where it was silence with the exception of the sounds of this crocodile repositioning itself periodically. A little after midnight, a huge storm rolled into this area, and it began absolutely downpouring, and the raindrops that were hitting the river were so loud that the teens could no longer hear the sound of this crocodile, and so they had no idea if it was still down below them or not. But every time lightning would strike, it would illuminate the sky for that flash of a second, and in that flash they would look down, and there would be the crocodile. After several hours of this super intense downpour, the two teens also started to become concerned that all this additional rain could raise the water level of the river all the way up high enough that this crocodile might be able to jump out and reach their legs. But because it was so dark, they couldn't actually see the top of the water, and so they had no way of knowing if the water levels were actually rising or not. And so they both kind of sucked their legs up onto this branch and tried to make themselves as small as they could while still remaining anchored to each other and also to the branch. And that's how they sat for the next several hours, just hoping they would survive the night. Finally, when the sun came up that following morning, the teens immediately noticed that the crocodile was still right below them, just lurking at the base of the tree waiting for them. And they also noticed the water level of the river had clearly come up quite a bit. And so if they weren't rescued soon, there was a good chance that another heavy rainstorm, that crocodile would be in range of them, and there was nowhere they could go. They were as high up as they could get. Not to mention the fact they were hypothermic, they were weak, they were tired, and if you fall asleep, you're going to fall in the water. And so the two teens, they knew they did not have much time left. Luckily, at 10 a.m. that morning, they heard the sound of a police officer who was out in the mangrove forest. It turned out their families had recognized their absence. They had called the police, and that morning a search had been launched. They had found their truck and then had been walking down the river yelling out to them, and then they finally did find them. Initially, when they located these two teens stuck in the tree, they called in a helicopter to hover over them and lower down a ladder that could climb back up. But when the helicopter got close to this tree, the rotor wash from the spinning blades, it practically blew the boys out of the tree, and this crocodile was still in the water. The rescuers could see it, the boys could still see it, and so there was this fear that the helicopter would literally send them into the water to their death. And so they had to abandon the helicopter approach. However, the blades of that helicopter did ultimately scare this crocodile, and the crocodile swam away. And so as soon as the helicopter was off station, they had a boat come in, and the boat got right underneath the two boys. They jumped down into it and they were brought to safety. The two boys were brought to a hospital where doctors determined they were physically okay, but both of them were severely traumatized from what they had just been through. As for Brett, despite an exhaustive search of that river, they never found his body or any of his clothing or any belongings he had on him, and they never found the crocodile that killed him. In 2019, a 32-year-old United States Army soldier was stationed in Hawaii for training. This was his first time ever being in Hawaii, and so on his first day off, he planned to do some sightseeing. After doing some research, he settled on the Hawaii Volcano National Park as the first place he would go check out. This is one of the top tourist attractions in Hawaii that sees over 2 million yearly visitors. One of the main draws of this particular park is that it's home to one of the world's most active volcanoes, the Kilauea, that has been erupting consistently almost every year since 1983. On the evening of Wednesday, May 1st, John finally was given some time off, and so he hopped in his rental car and he made his way out to the park. When he got there, he was pleasantly surprised to see that it was not crowded in the least, most likely because he was there midweek. And so he paid his entrance fee, and then he started walking up a trail that would bring him up to this overlook that overlooked the caldera. The caldera of a volcano is the actual crater, the inside of the volcano where the actual lava comes out of. At the time John was at the park, the volcano was not actively erupting, and so there was no pool of lava inside of the caldera. However, the surface of the caldera, which was 300 feet below this overlook where John is, the surface was still 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, causing these massive steam clouds to billow up from it pretty much constantly. And so when John actually reached this overlook point and was looking out into the caldera, he was immediately disappointed because he couldn't see anything. And so as much as John craned his neck to try to get a better look down into the caldera, he was just totally obscured by the steam. Now, he was up against a safety railing that prevented people from getting closer, but he figured if he could just get right to the edge of this crater and he could actually look down inside, he might be able to see all the way to the base of the caldera. And so he looked around and noticed there were no other tourists up there with him. So he thought about it for a second and then decided, yep, I'm gonna do this. And he stepped over the safety railing and walked right to the edge of this crater overlooking this caldera. And as soon as he got there, he suddenly had this unencumbered view of the space directly at the bottom of the edge of the cliff. He could actually see down into the caldera now. And so he got his phone out and he started taking some pictures, and then all of a sudden the ground underneath him began to shift, and it shifted so quickly and so suddenly that threw him onto his back. And as he's laying on his back scrambling to get back up again, the ground underneath him just completely collapses, sending him careening down 300 feet into the scalding hot caldera. When John fell, another tourist did happen to walk up another nearby trail, and they actually saw him as he fell. And so they called 911, and immediately first responders were on scene, but they were facing the same issue that John was, which is the steam was so intense inside of this volcano that you can't really see down into it. it. And so they had rescuers walking along the rim of the volcano, and they had helicopters in the air, but it really wasn't doing any good. And in the back of all rescuers' minds, they knew that realistically, there's just no way John could have survived this. I mean, you can't survive a 300-foot fall, but even if you did, you couldn't survive being at the surface of the caldera that's over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. You'd die within a couple of minutes. But the rescuers pushed that thought out of their mind, and they focused on being positive and just continuing to look for John. And 2 hours into their search, when it was totally dark outside and hope was just about gone at this point, somebody spotted John on a little ledge jutting out 70 feet down from that cliff he was standing on. When he fell, when the ground dissolved underneath him, he managed to land on this tiny little ledge. Had he fallen an inch left, an inch right, an inch forward, he would have tumbled to his death. There's no two ways about it. But he landed perfectly on the one ledge that could have saved his life. But he was so badly injured, he couldn't climb back up again. However, rescuers were able to rappel down to him, put him in a harness, get him back up, and he was able to make a full recovery. In December of 1961, James McCormick Sr. was on vacation from his job as a fire inspector for the city of Portland, Oregon. And he was feeling bored, he was feeling kind of restless, and he decided he wanted to go do something fun with his 16-year-old son named James McCormick Jr. They settled on going hunting together as they were both avid outdoorsmen, and so they, along with their hunting dog, headed out to Larch Mountain on December 4th. Even though Larch Mountain was only 30 miles from the city, it was known as one of the most rugged and wild areas in the northwestern United States. And so the men arrive at Larch Mountain, they're excited, they hop out of the car, they put their gear on, and they begin hiking into the wilderness. Now, the weather forecasters had said it was probably going to be pretty cold. There might be some light snow in the area, but the weather should hold for their day trip out into the woods. And so they hadn't brought any equipment to stay out for multiple days. This was just going to be a full day event, but back at night. But after walking for several hours into the mountains, they started to notice the temperature was dropping rapidly. And then it started to rain, and then it started to snow, all in a very short period of time. And initially they decided they were going to gut it out and keep walking a little ways, but they decided, you know what, this is awful and our stuff's getting wet and it's going to get dark soon, so let's just turn around and go back. We can go hunting another day. But it had started snowing so quickly that when they turned around to start making their way back to their vehicle, the snow had covered over everything enough that it looked a little bit different. And they didn't have a GPS, they were using a map and compass, and they were not on a marked trail. They were just kind of walking around the mountains looking for a place to set up. And so they're walking back and they're making turns and they're starting to question where they are. And when they had walked for several hours in the direction they believed was back to the truck, well, they weren't anywhere near a road and they felt like they were in an area they didn't recognize, and they realized they were lost. At this point, it was snowing really hard and it was starting to get dark outside. And so the pair decided, you know what? We got to stay out for the night. We're not going to find our vehicle tonight. It's too dark and we don't know where we are. So let's camp out for the night, and tomorrow we will find our vehicle. But remember, they didn't have any equipment to stay out for the night. All they had was their warm clothes, but they didn't have a structure to protect them from the elements. And so they decided their best bet was to climb up into a tree, because at least that way they're off the ground, they'd protect themselves from predators potentially, and the branches of the tree would kind of protect them a little bit from the snow and from the freezing rain. So that night, James Sr., James Jr., and their dog, they huddle in this tree. It's a totally sleepless, miserable night as they're just destroyed by snow and freezing rain and wind. And then finally the sun comes up the next morning and there's a glimmer of hope, although it's still absolutely dumping snow on them. But they're thinking to themselves, this is going to make a heck of a story when we get back. And so they climb out of the tree, they stretch, they kind of, readjust themselves, and then they begin walking in a direction that they think is the direction towards their vehicle. And for several hours, they're just kind of walking, hoping they're going to run into this road, and they don't. And at some point they realize once again that they are in the same position they were in the day before. They don't know where they are. And now they've walked even farther, potentially in the wrong direction. And so they stop for a second, and James Sr. pulls out his map and he's trying to make sense of where they might be. He's looking around, he's trying to terrain associate to see if he can figure out if there's a specific way he should be going. When his son, who was a really tough kid, didn't complain about anything, he said to his dad, I'm feeling delirious. I feel like I can't think straight, and it's hard for me to stand even. I'm gonna sit down. And his dad's looking at him, not concerned about this, because it was a pretty miserable night the night before, and so it makes sense he might be tired. But I mean, they had slept a full night's sleep the days leading up to this trip. They've only been out in the elements for one day. They do have warm clothes on, they do have food, they do have water. And so he figures his son will just sit down for a minute and then he'll get back up and be rejuvenated, and they'll keep moving out. And so James Sr. continues looking at his map. He's looking around, kind of waiting for his son to say, okay, I'm ready to start moving again. But his son just continues to deteriorate. He's speaking in nonsense, and he can't stand up. And this was the first time that James Sr. really started to feel concerned for their actual safety. Because even the night before, when they were up in the tree, even then, it just felt like it was this crazy thing that was happening to them and that everything would be fine. And even that morning when they got up and it was still snowing and they're still lost, he had that optimism, and so did his son. But now thinking, okay, we are potentially staring down another night out here, and we're gonna eventually run out of food and water. Our clothes are starting to get wet. The temperatures are dropping below freezing. We don't have a tent. We don't have a shelter. And now something's wrong with my son, which is concerning in and of itself. But if he can't move, then we can't make progress towards getting out of the situation. And so James Sr., who was this really fit fireman, he said, okay, I'm going to pick you up and I'm going to carry you. And he picked his son up, fireman's carry, put him over his shoulders. And for 3 hours, James Sr. just continues to march around looking for the way out. And after 3 hours, when they had not gotten anywhere closer to a road or any civilization, and now it was dark out again, he collapses with his son, and he puts his son down by a tree, and he sits down next to him, and he's totally defeated. And he's like, we got to get ready for another night. We got to get back up in a tree, and we got to do this again. And so as they're sitting there kind of talking about how they're going to get James Jr. up into a tree for the night because, he's too weak to climb up himself, they both notice these very bright lights about 100 feet in front of them that look like headlights. And James Sr. is like, oh my goodness, what luck. There is a road that we just didn't see, and there's a car that's parked right there. I'm going to go up and communicate with them and tell them that we are stuck out here and see if they can give us a ride. Stay right here. I'll be right back. And so James Sr. gets up and starts running towards these lights because these lights are their lifeline, and he wants to get to them before they potentially pull away without realizing, there's some people that really could use some help here. And so as he's moving, 50, 60, 70 feet away from where his son and his hunting dog were, the lights just continue to go farther and farther away from him to the point where James Sr. stops. And he's looking at these lights thinking, are those headlights? Like, what are those lights? And at some point, the lights just kind of disappear into the forest, and then they're gone. James Sr. looks around and he realizes, there's no road over here. I'm in the middle of the woods. Like, what were those lights? And so he stands there for a minute thinking to himself, am I losing my grip on reality? Like, what's going on here? And he turns around and he starts running back to where his son and his dog were. And when he gets there, only his dog is there. His son is now gone. And what's going through James Sr.'s mind is, how? Because he couldn't walk until now, and my son certainly wouldn't have lied to me and made me carry him all the way here. And there's enough light out that he could actually still see the footprints on the ground. And so he grabs his son's backpack that was left by the tree, he picks it up, he grabs his dog, and he starts yelling for his son and starts walking along the footprints that were left by, presumably, his son. And so he's walking along these footprints, and he's yelling out for his son, he's not hearing anything, and this whole time he's thinking to himself, like, why would he even leave? Even if he could move, why would he leave? We're obviously in this together. Like, what's going on with my son? And so he's walking, and after about 30 minutes of walking along these footprints, because the snow was coming down so heavy, the prints were getting harder and harder and harder to track because they were filling in with snow. And finally, it got dark out, and then he really couldn't see the prints anymore. And now James Sr. is absolutely panicked. This is a nightmare. Where's my son? What were those lights? Oh my gosh, it's going to be another night out here. And he just picks a random direction, and holding onto his son's stuff with his dog, he just starts running. The next day, James Sr. and his dog would stumble into this lodge that was about 6 miles away from where they had parked their car over at Larch Mountain. Now, that doesn't mean they moved 6 miles to get there. They probably zigged and zagged all over the mountain, and they covered much more than 6 miles, but it was a 6-mile shot to this lodge. They stumble inside, and it was just a miracle that he had found it. He basically had ran all night until he found a road, and he traced it up to this lodge. and he told the staff inside, "My son is missing. We've been gone for 2 days now. He's out in the middle of the woods. He's hurt. Someone needs to go out there." And so very quickly, the police were called, and word spread to the firefighters in Portland, Oregon, that the fire inspector's son is missing. And so 200 off-duty firefighters made their way up to the mountain as well to assist in this search. The paramedics wanted James Sr. to just go to the hospital and let the searchers do their job. But James Sr. was not about to leave his son, and he refused medical attention, and he went out with the first group of searchers. And somehow he was able to get them to the rough area that he was able to recognize as, roughly where his son had been sitting when he went missing. They searched that area and very quickly found James Jr.'s glasses case, as well as his boots and his socks, but no James Jr. Later in the day, though, they would find James Jr. He was about 1,000 feet away from where his boots and his glasses case were found, at the bottom of this cliff, and he was deceased. Now, initially the thought was, well, he must have gotten confused and walked away from where he had been told to sit and fell off this cliff. But they determined he did not die from the fall off this cliff. He had made his way down to that cliff and then died of exposure. So how was James Jr. able to suddenly be able to walk again? And once he had that skill back, why didn't he go to his dad? Why did he walk away from him? And why did he take his shoes and socks off to do that as well? And what were those lights that James Sr. saw in the middle of the woods? Because they weren't headlights. And it was only when he went to investigate them that suddenly James Jr. up and walks away. When most people picture Russia in their minds, they picture European Russia, which is literally the part of Russia on the western side that sits in Europe and is by far the most populated part of the country. But European Russia only accounts for 23% of the total territory that is Russia. The other 77% is to the east of European Russia. It starts at the Ural mountain range and it extends all the way over 5 million square miles to the Pacific Ocean. And this vast, mostly forested expanse, which is 50 times bigger than the entire United Kingdom, is called Siberia. And Siberia is absolutely brutal. In Siberia, it is almost always freezing cold. Literally, the average annual temperature across all of Siberia is 32.9 degrees Fahrenheit. So it is 0.9 degrees above freezing on average every single day. In addition to the extremely deadly weather that exists basically year-round in Siberia, Siberia is also home to a bunch of huge deadly animals, such as the brown bear, which is the same as the infamous grizzly bear in North America, the gray wolf, which by size alone makes virtually all other wolves look like little puppies. Gray wolves can grow to be nearly 200 pounds. And of course, there is the highly intelligent Siberian tiger, who is perhaps one of the only predators on Earth that is known to seek out and kill people for revenge. For example, in 1997, a hunter named Vladimir Markov was walking through a Siberian forest when he came face to face with one of these Siberian tigers, and he ended up shooting the tiger before fleeing, except the tiger didn't die. Instead, it got up and secretly followed Vladimir all the way back to his cabin, and then this tiger camped out outside of the cabin until Vladimir came out again, and the tiger pounced, killed him, and ate him. And so, unsurprisingly, Siberia has an absolutely minuscule population relative to its massive size. However, there are some adventurous people out there who are drawn to Siberia for the same reasons that most other people avoid it. These adventurous people see Siberia as one of the last truly wild places on our planet, and they want to experience it for themselves. And one of these highly adventurous people was a young man named Colin Madsen. Colin, who came from a very successful American family, was a big outdoors enthusiast who at some point in his youth began researching Siberia because he fell in love with its rugged natural beauty. He quickly began researching not only Siberia, but Siberian culture and Russian culture, and also at some point he became fluent in the Russian language. Then, in 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he left his home in Missouri and moved to Siberia. He settled in one of Siberia's few population centers, a city called Irkutsk, which is located in the southeast of Siberia and right along the edge of Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Colin's Siberia plan was twofold. He would go to school while he was there, and he would go out and explore. And at first, his plan went perfectly. He was accepted into Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, and very quickly he made friends who were eager to accompany him on his adventures out into the Siberian wilderness. From his arrival in Siberia in 2013 to 2016, Colin did well in his studies, and he spent countless hours exploring the forests and mountainous areas all around Lake Baikal and right outside of Irkutsk. In fact, Colin became so familiar with this region that he began volunteering with a nonprofit in the area that went around marking new trails, which meant Colin was literally venturing into the wilds of Siberia and just marking the trail as he went. So when Colin's family heard about what happened to him in 2016, they could not believe it. In March of 2016, Colin and 3 of his good hiking friends, one was American and 2 were Russian, decided they wanted to go on a hike together. They settled on hiking to the summit of Love Peak, which was a mountain located a few hours away from Irkutsk in a small village called Arshan. This hike was nothing compared to the gnarly Siberian wilderness hikes all 4 of these guys had been on before. The trail that led up to Love Peak, it was fairly steep, but it was incredibly well marked, and all 4 of these guys had hiked it several times before. However, because Colin and his friends were so experienced at hiking in Siberia, they knew that even the easiest hikes needed to be respected because Siberia was still Siberia. There were dangers that lurked everywhere. And so the men called ahead to the village of Arshan and they rented one of these small rustic cabins that's in the village that sits right at the base of Love Peak, and it's kind of tucked away in this forest. And so this cabin would serve as their sort of base camp and would allow them to arrive in Arshan, get their gear together, and then when they were ready, they could begin this hike to the summit. And so a few days later, on March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends loaded up their car and they drove west to Arshan, and when they got there, they stopped at a local store and got some supplies, and then made their way to their cabin. Their cabin was just a single room with a few beds inside of it. It was enough to protect them from the elements, but really nothing more. As for a toilet, the cabin didn't have one, but there was an outhouse outside that they could use. So after the friends moved into the cabin and claimed their beds and put their things down, they all sat down and began prepping their gear and eating some food and chatting. And then finally at 2 a.m., they decided they needed to go to sleep because their plan was to get on the path up to Love Peak by 7 a.m., which meant they needed to get up at 5 a.m. to make their final preparations. So at 2 a.m., the lights in the cabin turned off and the friends all fell asleep. And then 3 hours later at 5 a.m., when the lights came back on again, it was immediately clear something was wrong. Colin was not in his bed. His friends assumed, when they looked over at his bed and saw his personal belongings were all still there, that Colin must have gotten up and headed outside, maybe to use the outhouse or go for a quick walk, and they just hadn't heard him leaving. And so the 3 friends initially just kind of shrugged off Colin's absence and said, he'll be back any minute, most likely, and if for some reason he's not back soon, he'll certainly be back by 7 a.m., because that was the agreed upon time they would leave for this hike. But as the minutes ticked closer and closer to 7 a.m., and Colin still had not shown up or tried to call them or do anything, the friends started to worry. It just didn't make any sense that Colin would just get up and leave without telling them where he was going. Finally, at 7 a.m., when Colin still had not shown up, and the friends' cursory search of the outside area near the cabin had yielded no results, they decided they had to tell someone. And so they wrote a note addressed to Colin, and they put it on the front of their cabin door. And this note basically just told Colin, if you come back here and you see this note, know that we're looking for you. So stay put or tell someone you're here. And so after putting up this note, the friends left the cabin and they headed to the nearest police station where they reported Colin missing. The police would eventually launch this huge search in and around Arshan, both in the forested area right around the village and then also up into the mountains near Love Peak. But despite this huge effort, no one could find Colin, at least not at first. On Monday, April 4th, so 8 days into Colin's disappearance, a group of searchers were looking in the forest about 1 mile away from the cabin where Colin and his friends had been staying. And they look up ahead and they see there is this clearing and there's something in the middle of it. And so the searchers begin moving their way towards this clearing, ducking under branches and stepping over brush. And when they get close enough, they can see Colin is in the clearing, and Colin is deceased. He was laying flat on his back with his left arm extended out to the side and his right arm extended but closer to his body, and both of his hands were clenched in tight fists. And on his hands and his wrists were visible abrasions and cuts, which later would be determined to have most likely been caused from someone or something holding onto him, trying to restrain Colin. Colin also had visible abrasions and cuts on the front of his neck. Colin's clothing, which consisted of a long-sleeve thermal shirt, heavy pants, and hiking boots, were ripped and torn in several places. And interestingly, Colin was not wearing socks under his boots. Now that seems inconsequential, but Colin had had surgery on both of his ankles and had scar tissue on his ankles that if he didn't have socks on, those scars would rub against the inside of his boot, and he said it was very painful. So he always wore socks. Also, Colin's body showed virtually no signs of decomposition, and all of his wounds and abrasions looked, quote, fresh, according to medical personnel. In short, Colin looked like he had recently been in some sort of physical altercation, and whoever or whatever he was grappling with had eventually overpowered him and killed him, although it was not clear how he actually died. Russian authorities were very quick to suspect Colin's 3 friends who had been with him, but they were brought into the station and they denied having anything to do with Colin's death, and they all passed their lie detector tests. After that, Russian authorities quickly closed this case by concluding that, well, if his friends didn't do it, then that means Colin must have been high on drugs or drinking alcohol or both, and he just wandered out of his cabin and he got lost in the woods and he died of hypothermia. He froze to death. The end. However, Colin's parents just could not accept that as being what happened to their son. There were a lot of reasons for skepticism, but the main one was that Colin was an absolute expert at navigating this particular region of Siberia. And so the idea that he would leave his cabin for a quick walk or something and get so completely lost that he would die 8 days later seemed way too far-fetched. And so Colin's parents hired a US-based private lab to do a review of Russia's autopsy of Colin to give their opinion if the autopsy was accurate or not. And this US-based lab pretty much immediately found that the Russian autopsy was not remotely accurate. Number 1, Colin was not under the influence of alcohol or drugs. He was sober, although technically he did have very small amounts of THC in his urine. THC is the chemical that is found in marijuana, but the amount was so little, it basically meant he had consumed the THC days before he went missing, and so he would not have been remotely affected by that small amount of THC in his system. Number 2, the lab determined that Colin almost certainly did not die from hypothermia. Instead, all signs pointed to Colin dying from being suffocated, meaning he was murdered. Someone crushed his airway or in some way restricted him from breathing, and that's what killed him. And 3, based on the lack of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries on Colin's body, and the lack of animal predation on his body when they found him, indicated that Colin did not just wander out of his cabin and immediately die somewhere in the forest. Instead, he was alive for most of the time people were looking for him, meaning when they found him, he likely had died within hours of being found. And so these findings by this US-based lab kind of create a general theory about what must have happened to Colin. After Colin left the cabin in the early morning hours of March 28th, maybe to go to the outhouse or to go for a quick walk, when he went outside, someone or something was nearby, and they either lured Colin to them or they straight up ambushed Colin and took him away. Now, we have no idea what happened to Colin after he was abducted, but we can safely assume that after being abducted and taken somewhere, he was alive, and he stayed alive for several days until on the 8th day of his disappearance, Colin was killed, likely by his captor, either at the spot where he was found, or he was killed somewhere else, maybe in the forest, and then moved to the spot where he was found. Many people believe it was the Russian government who targeted Colin, they kidnapped him, and they killed him. And their botched investigation into his death was actually a calculated cover-up. Colin had participated in at least one peaceful environmentalist-led protest in Siberia, and after the protest, Colin apparently got a written warning by the Russian police not to attend another protest. But why would Colin, who was just one of many people involved in these protests, be singled out by the Russian government and killed for his participation? And why would the government elect to kill Colin when he was with 3 of his closest friends who would immediately notice his absence? It just doesn't add up. Today, Colin's parents are still trying to figure out what happened to their son, but unfortunately, their son's case is closed in Russia, and so no one on the Russian side is talking to the parents or giving them any new information. And so as a result, they and the rest of us are left to wonder who or what was lurking in the shadows when Colin stepped out of the cabin that morning. And then where did they take him? And what did they do to him for nearly a week before they killed him deep inside of that Siberian forest? On the afternoon of January 22nd, 2024, an elderly woman named Janet Lee sat in front of her computer in an office on the second floor of her home in Newcastle, England. She was going over some recent bank statements, but it was kind of hard. She was distracted because all she could hear was her boyfriend downstairs talking to someone. So Janet's boyfriend was a guy named Richard O'Connell, and he and Janet had been together for about 20 years. Now, despite not officially being married, they sort of functioned like a married couple. They lived together, they shared everything. In fact, Janet had even written Richard into her will. Janet thought her and Richard would be together forever. I mean, clearly, if you're writing him into your will. And she assumed that that feeling was reciprocated, that Richard also felt like they were together forever. But lately, their relationship had gotten pretty rocky, and in fact, both of them had begun openly talking about the possibility that they might need to break up. Now, nothing was set in stone, and by no means were they destined for a breakup, but it was suddenly, a possibility, and that was really hard for Janet to deal with. And so, as Janet sat upstairs trying to do these bank statements, but, getting completely sidetracked just by the sound of Richard's voice, part of the reason that was so distracting is, Richard was all she could think about. What would happen if they broke up? What would her life look like? And so before long, her mind was kind of wandering, and no longer was it the bank statements. It was, what does the future hold for me? It seems so uncertain. And so as Janet is having this moment upstairs, she suddenly hears Richard start yelling downstairs. And at first, it kind of sounded like maybe he was yelling at the person he had been talking to. But the more Janet listened, she could tell it really wasn't that he was yelling as much as he was screaming, like he was screaming out in pain or something. And so Janet got out of her chair and ran downstairs to see what was going on. And when she did, she looked towards the front door and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize, but he looked weirdly familiar to her. He was wearing a white lab coat, his back was to her, and he was walking out the front door. And before she could even begin to process who this guy was and what he was doing here, she heard the sound of Richard again kind of calling out in pain, less loudly this time, but definitely in real pain. Then she turned, and sure enough, there was Richard in the living room, clutching his shoulder and grimacing like something was really hurting him. And so Janet, she walked over to him and she's like, what's going on? Like, what's wrong with you? And who was that guy? And tell me, what's happening here? And so Richard, through gritted teeth, would tell her that he had just gotten a COVID vaccine shot and it really hurt. And that guy who had just given it to him was a guy from NHS, the National Health Service, and he just came by to administer the shot. And so Janet heard what he said, but it wasn't really computing. Like, why aren't you getting the shot done at the doctor's office? Why are you having somebody come here to administer it? That's unusual. But, as she was thinking about this, she could clearly see that what was really important right now was that Richard was in agonizing pain. I mean, he was holding his arm and kind of rocking back and forth, moaning. Clearly, he was having some sort of reaction to the shot. And so she forgot about the weirdness around why he got the shot and how he got the shot, and said to him, like, hey, do you want to go to the hospital? I can drive you. And at this, Richard kind of sat up straight and took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm himself down. And even though obviously his shoulders still hurt from the shot, he said to Janet that, the guy from the NHS told me this was normal. There's pain associated with this particular shot, and it would just go away on its own. And so I'm just gonna wait and let this thing fade. At this point, Janet was still worried about Richard, but, he seemed pretty confident that this was not a big deal. And so she decided she would simply follow his lead. And she said, okay, if that's what you want to do. And then she turned and she went upstairs and continued trying to do her bank statements. But 2 days later, Janet did end up driving Richard to the hospital. Because over those 48 hours since Richard got that COVID shot, the spot on his arm, the injection site, had turned red and began to blister and bleed. And then eventually it turned black. And so at that point, they went to the ER. Hospital doctors would diagnose Richard with something called necrotizing fasciitis, which is a bacterial infection more commonly known as flesh-eating disease. Basically, the skin and muscle of Richard's arm was dying and rotting, but from the inside out. The doctors told Richard he would have to have emergency surgery to remove the rotting flesh to stop the spread of this infection. But before they could even do that, they needed to figure out how this infection had even begun. And so at this point, Richard began telling the doctors all about how, 2 days earlier he'd gotten his COVID shot, and pretty much right away it had been so painful, and then it blistered and bled and turned black. And then also, over the course of this discussion that Janet is listening to as well, Richard began describing the NHS guy who had actually come to his house. Now remember, Janet had only seen this guy for a brief second when she had run downstairs. She had seen him walking out the front door, she just saw the white lab coat, but something about him seemed weirdly familiar, but she kind of put that thought out of her mind. But now, as she's listening to Richard describe this NHS guy with a little more detail this time, suddenly something clicked. She realized she knew why this guy seemed so familiar. And this realization filled her with horror. It would turn out that NHS nurse was not really an NHS nurse. Instead, they were a man that both Janet and Richard knew very well. However, they were extremely well disguised, and so Janet and Richard did not recognize them. This man's name was Thomas Kwan. And Thomas, after coming inside their home, did not inject Richard with COVID-19 vaccine. Instead, he injected Richard with a deadly pesticide called iodomethane. That pesticide immediately caused that excruciating pain that Richard was feeling that caused him to scream out, and ultimately killed and began to rot away the flesh in his arm. It would turn out Thomas Kwan was Janet's son, and he was furious at her for putting Richard in her will and allowing Richard to get her house when she died. And so he decided he would basically inject poison into Richard, killing Richard to secure the house for himself. But Richard would survive the ordeal. He would have to undergo several pretty intense surgeries, but he ended up being okay. As for Thomas, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 31 years in prison. On a sunny afternoon in August of 2014, a 24-year-old tourist, who we're going to call Angela Lyons, drove a rented moped through a busy street in Vietnam. Angela had come here about a week earlier from Scotland, where she lived, and so far the trip had been great. She'd been going to nightclubs and partying and eating local food and swimming in local rivers. I mean, all in all, she was having a blast. And now she was just cruising slowly on her moped, looking at all the shops around her and kind of taking in the scenery. And at some point, as she was driving, she turned her head, and then she felt her moped hit something really hard, and she actually fell off her bike onto the ground. She hit her head pretty hard, but luckily she was wearing a helmet, and so she was able to stand up and kind of assess that she was physically going to be okay. And she looked and saw what she had run into, and it was actually another moped. And fortunately, the crash was kind of low speed, and so the other moped driver clearly was physically okay as well, and their mopeds were not actually damaged at all. And so after she said she was sorry, and the two kind of just acknowledged that they were just going to go their separate ways, the other moped driver hopped back on their moped and drove off, and Angela just to make sure she really was okay here, because again, she hit her head pretty hard on the concrete. And so Angela, she took off her helmet and kind of felt around her scalp, and sure enough, she felt a little bump on her head from where she'd hit the ground, but other than that, she seemed fine. Now, because it was a head injury, albeit a small one, Angela did consider just going to the hospital just to be sure. But, as she felt it a couple more times, she's like, you know what, it's pretty small. This is not a big deal. I'm okay. And so she put her helmet back on, got on her moped, and went on about her business. About a week later, Angela was back home in Glasgow, Scotland, and she was inside of her doctor's office about to be examined. Following that moped accident, Angela had stayed in Vietnam for a few more days. And the whole time, she had checked that bump on her head every single day, and it had gone away pretty quickly. However, when she landed back home in Scotland, almost right away, she began developing this kind of startling new symptom that she couldn't help but feel must be connected to the moped accident, and it made her really scared. And so she had gone to the doctor. Her new symptom were these sudden kind of extreme nosebleeds. And so she had made an appointment to go see her doctor to figure out what the heck was going on. And so finally, Angela's doctor came into the room, and he would examine her, and he would look at her nose and her head, and he would listen to her story about the moped. But after he was done with the exam, he would tell Angela that he did not think her nosebleeds had anything to do with the moped accident. Much more realistically, the nosebleeds were from her body adjusting to the weather in Scotland. Vietnam, it was a very hot environment, and Scotland was very cold, and so that shift was likely causing these nosebleeds. And so the doctor recommended that Angela put some Vaseline inside of her nostrils to keep it moist, and just wait for this to clear up as her body transitioned back to Scotland. A few days later, Angela was back home inside of her bathroom looking into a mirror. She was applying some Vaseline to her nostrils. Now, she had been doing this every day, multiple times a day, since the doctor had made that recommendation, but despite following the doctor's orders, her nosebleeds had persisted. If anything, they were getting worse. She was having these things multiple times a day. But for now, Angela simply turned on her shower and waited for the water to warm up, and then she hopped inside. And after a few minutes of just kind of standing under the water, Angela began just kind of touching her nose, something she was doing a lot of, since these nosebleeds had begun. Except as she touched her nose, she began to feel something weird sort of deep inside of her nostril that she maybe hadn't noticed before, and at some point, she actually pushed pretty hard on whatever this was inside of her nasal cavity. And when she did that, it sent this blinding wave of pain over her, and then simultaneously, blood began pouring out of her nose, and she couldn't get it to stop. It was like this flood of just constant bleeding, and it terrified Angela. She'd had these terrible nosebleeds, but this was the worst one, and it was clearly connected to something inside of her nose. And so she's starting to panic, blood's getting everywhere, and she's thinking this has gotta be connected to that moped accident. Maybe I have some horrible brain injury. Maybe I'm dying here. And so in a panic, she jumps out of the shower, towels off, gets dressed, and rushes to the nearest hospital. When Angela got to the emergency room, a nurse quickly brought her into an exam room and had her sit down and tilt her head back so the nurse could look into her nostrils to see what was going on. And so Angela, she's got all this gauze to kind of trap the blood, and she's got her head way back, and she's letting the nurse do this exam. And after a while, Angela starts to realize that this exam is taking a really long time. The nurse is just kind of standing there, clearly looking at her nostrils, but not saying anything. And, from Angela's perspective, she can't really see the nurse. Her head is tilted too far back. But the silence that's grown in the room is so loud at this point that Angela finally just kind of sits up and looks at the nurse to see what's going on here. And she sees the nurse is kind of frozen, like she's looking at Angela's nostrils like she can't believe what she's seen. And then the nurse kind of snaps out of it and looks at Angela and says, "Stay calm. I'm gonna get the doctor." And Angela's like, "I am calm. What's going on here?" But then the nurse just turns around and speed walks out of the room. It would turn out Angela's primary care doctor had been right when he said he didn't think her nosebleeds had anything to do with that moped accident. This was not a brain injury or anything connected to the trauma. However, her nosebleeds were connected to something else she had done while in Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, in between, going out to nightclubs and partying and trying all that great food, Angela was also swimming in these local rivers. And at one point, when she was in one of those rivers, something found its way into her nose. A 3-inch long blood-sucking leech. It had been living deep inside of Angela's nostril and sinus cavity for over a week, separated from her brain only by this extremely fragile bone that's only about a half millimeter thick. Hospital doctors would spend about 30 minutes painstakingly pulling this leech out of Angela's nose, and then once it was out, she would go on to make a full recovery. One morning in February of 1987, a 45-year-old woman named Janet Overton stood in front of her bathroom mirror inside of her home in Dana Point, California. Janet was a member of the board for the school district that her 17-year-old son attended, and she had a big meeting that day. But as she looked at herself in the mirror, she looked terrible. She was pale and exhausted, and she had these big dark circles under her eyes. Now, Janet knew why she looked this way. It's because the last couple of days, she'd felt really sick, kinda out of nowhere. She'd been all stuffed up, she had bouts of nausea off and on, she wasn't sleeping very well. She figured she just had a bad cold and hoped if she could just kind of muscle her way through it, she could avoid going to the doctor. But now here she was, about to have this big school board meeting, still feeling sick, still looking terrible. But instead of kind of canceling her plans and going to the doctor, she just caked on more makeup, did up her hair, and headed out the door. A few weeks later, Janet suddenly woke up in the middle of the night feeling so nauseous that she leapt out of her bed and ran to the bathroom and vomited. And then afterwards, she just sat on the ground sweating and shaking. So over the last few weeks, Janet's cold had not really gone away. In fact, if anything, it had just gotten progressively worse. Now, Janet had gone to the doctor about it eventually, and the doctor had agreed with her that, maybe you do have some really bad cold or some other virus here. But the only thing they told her to do was just, rest and stay really well hydrated, and whatever this is, it'll just run its course. And so that's exactly what Janet had been doing over these several weeks, but it hadn't helped. Janet's nausea had gotten so bad and so severe that she basically couldn't eat. And then she had also fallen behind on her work for the school board because she was so weak all the time. Janet forced herself to stand up off the bathroom floor, then she turned on the sink and began splashing cold water on her face. But as she did that, she noticed something new. She saw there was this red, scaly rash on her arms. And so she stepped back and pulled her sleeves up, and she saw the rash extended up onto her shoulders and up onto her neck and down her back. And when she touched it, it really hurt. I mean, this is a brand new symptom here, and she could tell it had to be connected to whatever this mystery illness was, and it terrified her. Like, what was happening to her body? And so she decided that night she had to go to the ER. The next day, Janet laid in a hospital bed with an IV in her arm and her husband and her son sitting right beside her. She still felt absolutely horrible. She still felt nauseous, she had cold symptoms, and that rash had now spread up to her neck and onto her face, and it had begun to blister. All night, the doctors had been running tests on Janet to try to figure out what was going on. But every test they ran came back negative. She didn't have the flu, and she didn't have at least any known infections or diseases that could cause these symptoms. And so the doctors were at a loss. However, scans of Janet's abdomen did reveal something concrete. She had all these ulcers in her stomach, which basically are like open sores in her stomach lining. And so the doctors told her very likely it was these ulcers that were causing her extreme nausea and making it really hard to eat. But like everything else they were seeing with Janet, they had no idea why she was developing these ulcers in the first place. And so ultimately, all the doctors could really do for Janet was just treat her symptoms. They gave her ulcer medication, and they also gave her some topical treatments for her rash. And over the next couple of days, these treatments seemed to work. Her ulcers went away, and her rash basically disappeared, and overall she felt a lot better. Not back to 100%, but pretty close, to the point where she was discharged. And so Janet and the doctors were like, okay, we don't really know what this was or why it started. We just hope it never comes back. Several months later, on January 24th, 1988, Janet was at home getting ready for a whale watching trip with her 17-year-old son, and she felt horrible. Ever since leaving the hospital, she had periodically just kept getting sick over and over and over again.
And each time she would go back to the hospital and they would just, treat her symptoms because no one could figure out what was wrong with her. And then eventually she'd get better and go back home and the cycle would repeat. And so on this particular day, even though Janet felt sick as a dog, she just told herself she was going to push through this and try to have a good day with her son on this whale watching trip. So she put on a ton of makeup, she put her hair up, slammed some coffee, and then went downstairs to meet her son. Then the two of them headed outside, walked over to the car, and right as Janet was about to grab the car door handle and get inside, she stood there for a second and then just collapsed. Janet's husband and son immediately rushed Janet to the hospital, but by the time they got there, it was already too late. Janet was dead. Her doctors were obviously baffled because they had been baffled for months now. Nobody knew what was happening to her. And so ultimately they brought in a coroner to do an autopsy to try to figure out once and for all what was going on with Janet. And as soon as the coroner cut open Janet's stomach to examine the contents, he was hit with this smell that was very distinct that instantly told him exactly what had killed Janet. And as soon as he smelled it, he stopped what he was doing and contacted the police. And the police immediately sent detectives to Janet's house, and they began gathering up all these items inside the house to be tested. And the results of these tests confirmed the coroner's theory. As Janet got sicker and sicker, she had this mentality of like, I'm gonna push through this thing and not go to the doctor. I'm just gonna pretend this isn't even happening. And so when she was caking on all that makeup every day and chugging all this coffee, to combat the tiredness, that was all just an effort to, pretend this wasn't really happening. But what she didn't realize is that the makeup and the coffee were actually killing her. It would turn out there was a deadly chemical in her makeup called selenium that was slowly killing her. And then in her coffee was cyanide. And cyanide has a very distinctive smell. It smells like almonds. And that's what the coroner smelled when he opened up her stomach. But these deadly chemicals did not appear in her makeup and coffee naturally. They were put there by Janet's husband. He believed Janet was having an affair, and so he set out to murder her. He first began placing the selenium in her makeup, and it was slowly killing Janet, but it was not happening fast enough. And so finally, on the day of the whale watching trip, her husband put the cyanide in her coffee, and it killed her pretty much right away. Richard Overton was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2009.
On January 30th, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. And so after walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out, and then eventually he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. And so without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave. And Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels, but today his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old, and he knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored. And so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave and map it all out and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot wide cathedral-like space inside of this hill with ceilings high enough you could stand, but it's totally dark in there. And despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. And so, as Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing, even for a very experienced caver. And so Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway, and he reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. And this tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. And Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going, because again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving. He loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so Floyd got to this hole, he put his oil lamp down on the ground, he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet, and then once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. And so he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel. And after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction. And so he immediately began going head first into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go head first into a tunnel and you get stuck, what are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going head first into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way head first and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. It's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity. But as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath. By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was, where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees on, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in, because those were the big tourist attractions. Not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd, because it allowed him to advertise that this cave where tourists could go explore was full of all this rich history. And so Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him, with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of Sand Cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground, the walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. Now, to most people, that would be terrifying, but Floyd, again, was so experienced, he was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill, and then he rolled onto his back. So his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling, and he's on his back. And so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm. He knew where he was in the cave. He just needed to get to that little pocket. He'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up, eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole. He'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black, he can't see anything, and so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him. But then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the low ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. And in fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave. And so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of like hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle. And his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then I'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock, but his foot wouldn't budge. And so Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out. He'd just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low, and he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing, and they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here, they would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness, trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours, and then finally, he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard, because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness, I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in. And Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, he shines the light on Floyd, and the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, had set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now, but Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful. He's very relieved. He says goodbye to Homer, and Homer turns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself. And so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd, he's laying there kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him. And then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time. But luckily, Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked. And so Floyd was in good spirits, and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you got to remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home and sleep and eat and drink and kind of recover. But he told Floyd, don't worry, tomorrow more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get Floyd out of there. But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside of this tunnel with the rock pinning his leg, and despite Homer and several other men getting down there and very diligently chipping away at this tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. And so over the course of those 50 hours, Floyd began going in and out of consciousness, and he began not being able to differentiate between what was real and what was not. At one point, he would say that he believed the cave had kind of opened up and these angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come in to save him. And as they were lifting him out of the cave, he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly his hallucination cleared and he realized he was trapped in the darkness all alone, still in this cave. And it was like it destroyed his morale. And so Floyd is really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers are realizing they need to do something, and they need to do something now. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse for Floyd. As he was laying there in the tunnel, this was sometime in the middle of the night, and so no rescuers were actively down there trying to chisel their way down to him. He was laying there and he was listening to the sound of the running water somewhere outside the cave, and that sound was kind of amplified down to him. And then all of a sudden, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere up above, and then when those rocks stopped and it went silent again, he could not hear the sound of the running water. It was very muffled. And that was when he realized that there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up in the cave, which meant potentially there could be a significant block just to get down to him. Forget about widening this tunnel. I mean, he could be actually entombed inside of Sand Cave. And so Floyd did the only thing he could do, which was to pray. It would turn out that cave-in had indeed blocked the way for rescuers to get down to Floyd. And because of how extensive this cave-in was, the rescuers actually decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. I mean, this is an even bigger undertaking than just chiseling the side of the tunnel that Floyd was in, which was their original plan and had taken several days. And so now they have to build this brand new tunnel to Floyd. And so finally, on February 16th, 1925, so a staggering 17 days from the time Floyd got first stuck in this cave, the rescue team finally punched through and reached Floyd. And as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, and then he paused, he turned up, and he just said, "Dead." It would turn out shortly after that cave-in, which sealed Floyd in completely inside of Sand Cave, at some point over the next couple of days, those rocks began to break free and tumble down the cave and began striking Floyd until finally one or several of those rocks hit him in the head or chest and killed him. So just imagine you are trapped. You've been there for several days. You're in total darkness. You're entombed inside of this cave, and periodically rocks just come tumbling down and smash into you. Who knows how long it took to kill him, but that has to be one of the most agonizing ways to go ever. Shortly before that cave-in first happened, a photographer took a picture of Floyd, who at the time believed he was going to get out, and all the rescuers believed they were going to get him out. But shortly after this photo was taken, the cave-in would happen, and at that point, Floyd didn't know it, but he was doomed. Here is that photo. Floyd's body was eventually removed from Sand Cave. However, instead of being buried, because of the interest around this cave rescue that ultimately failed, there was a decision made to actually put Floyd's body on display inside of another cave. Basically, Floyd's body became a tourist attraction. And it would remain a tourist attraction for decades until finally he was removed from that cave and given a proper burial.
On the evening of December 28, 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt drove down the highway into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Beside him was his 11-year-old daughter, Sienna, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. They'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, all the way from Don's mother's home in California, where they'd just spent Christmas. But the holiday had not really been a happy one, because a few weeks earlier, Don's sister, Janice, had died of breast cancer. And Janice was really one of the only true close family members Don had left. His dad and his other sister were both already dead, and his younger brother Dennis wasn't talking to him after a big argument the year before. So, as soon as Don had gotten the news that Janice had unfortunately passed away, he'd immediately negotiated with his ex-wife to take their daughter, Sienna, and go see his mom. He wished they could have stayed longer, but he had to get back to work. Don had a job at an agency that served the developmentally disabled, and there was a big meeting coming up that he just couldn't miss. Just then, Don slammed on his brakes. Traffic ahead was piling up, and the car in front of him had slowed down to an abrupt stop. Don felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, and he laid on his horn. He was about to roll down the window so he could scream at the driver in front of him, but then he saw Sienna open her eyes in alarm in the seat next to him, and he stopped himself. Don took a deep breath and reminded himself that it was just traffic and it wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have kind of a temper when it came to driving, but in recent years, he'd been working hard to control it so he could set a good example for his daughter. So after the traffic finally let up, and as he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through downtown Albuquerque toward his house, Don deliberately tried to shift his focus to something positive. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And that always made Don smile. Spaghetti Sunday was a tradition that he and Sienna had started together a few years ago by making big batches of food every Sunday after church and bringing the food downtown to feed the homeless. At first, it had just been the two of them, but over time, more people had joined in the effort, and pretty soon it had grown into a real event with whole groups of volunteers coming out to serve food and drop off clothes and canned goods. Don felt proud that he'd created something so meaningful for the community, and it was especially important to him that he had done it with Sienna. Finally, Don turned down a quiet residential street and parked in the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse decorated with Christmas lights. He got out of the car with Sienna, grabbed their suitcases, and walked to the front door and unlocked it. And when his daughter stepped inside, she shrieked with excitement, because waiting for her under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle wrapped in a shiny bow. She turned around and asked her dad if she could give the bike a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes, but it was already dark out and this was supposed to be a quick stop at his house, and when he looked at the clock, he saw that it was almost 7. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday, and he had to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a pretty civil relationship, but he knew she would be annoyed if he asked for more time.
So Dawn told Sienna the bike would have to wait, but for now, just go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would leave. As Sienna ran off, Dawn noticed something strange. He hadn't seen his golden retriever, Buddy, who usually rushed out to greet him whenever he came home. So Dawn walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name, and finally found the dog cowering in the bedroom. Dawn extended his hand, and Buddy skittishly came forward to sniff it. And Dawn was a little unnerved by this. Buddy usually did not act scared of him. But then again, Dawn didn't usually leave for weeks at a time either, so he just told himself that, maybe this was just separation anxiety. So he gave Buddy a pat on the head, filled his bowl with kibble, and then grabbed his keys for the short drive to his ex-wife Christine's house. Dawn drove to Christine's very slowly, trying to enjoy every last bit of his time with Sienna. Dawn treasured the time he had with his daughter, because the mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost gotten her taken away from him. These days, Dawn lived a squeaky clean life and went to church every Sunday, but it was not always that way. He had partied a lot when he was younger, and when Sienna was a toddler, he'd gotten fired from his dream job as a firefighter for failing a drug test. And then after he'd lost his job, his then wife, Christine, had to shoulder most of the family's bills, and after a few months, the strain on the marriage was just too much. Christine filed for divorce, which was crushing for Dawn, but even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Dawn actually already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and after that divorce, his first wife had gotten sole custody of those kids and moved them all to Oklahoma, so Dawn had barely seen them for most of their childhoods. He was determined not to make that same mistake with Sienna. So he'd gone to court to fight Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten a little contentious, but it was worth it, and Dawn made the most of every moment he got to spend with Sienna. He'd braid her hair before school and make costumes for her school plays, and on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he always called her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Dawn pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway, and Christine came outside and stood by the front door with her arms crossed. She motioned to her watch, clearly annoyed that Dawn was late. Dawn got out of the car and sort of apologized and told her it had been a really long drive from California, and they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and they'd hit some traffic. That was why they were late. Christine sighed and said it was okay. She asked about the trip, and Dawn told her it went well. They had a great Christmas despite the, sadness over his sister's death, and it had been very meaningful just to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Dawn pulled her in for a big hug and kiss, and then he promised to call her before bed as usual. And when he saw her again that weekend, they'd have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Dawn pulled back into his garage 10 minutes later, he noticed that the trash can at the end of his driveway was lying overturned on its side. So he parked his truck, walked down to the curb, and flipped it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed a button to close the garage door, and unlocked the door to his townhouse. And while he was taking off his shoes and jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing and roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the sensor. He stopped to listen, and now what he heard was the sound of the door actually closing again and actually hitting the ground with a soft thud. He shook his head and decided he must be imagining things. Dawn dragged his suitcase into the bedroom and began to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and not really think about anything. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he saw a small hole in the ceiling and let out a frustrated sigh. Dawn had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months, and he'd been hoping it would have been done by the time he got home. So he made a mental note to give the landlord yet another call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Dawn put his jacket and his shoes back on and then headed out to the garage to smoke a cigarette. The following morning, December 29th, at the office where Dawn worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up and heard Dawn's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna told Valerie that her dad did not call her last night and asked if he was there now at the office. So Valerie stood up and peered over at Dawn's desk, but it was empty. This was a little unusual, since Dawn was a pretty punctual guy, but it was still early, so she told Sienna not to worry. She would give Dawn a call now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone, but he didn't answer. So she sent him a text message, and she waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied. And now Valerie was starting to feel concerned. It was not like Don to skip work without calling in, and then ignore calls and texts too. And so Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy when Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked on the door, but to her surprise, it actually just swung right open. She looked over at her coworker, then the two of them nervously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but he didn't answer, so she wandered into the living room and peeked into the bedroom, but the house seemed empty. Valerie's coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor, and Valerie headed out to the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. And when Valerie opened the door to the two-car garage attached to the townhouse and flipped on the light, she saw Don's truck was in its usual spot. But something else caught her eye. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV, she noticed a streak of something dark red on the wall. At this point, Valerie started to feel pretty nervous. But nonetheless, she began walking towards that back wall to see what was going on over there. And as she got closer and closer, she was staring at the streak, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, until finally she was close enough that she could actually look down at the space between the SUV and the red streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, Albuquerque police detective Matthew Kaplan pulled up in front of a two-story stucco townhouse secured with yellow crime scene tape and swarming with police officers. Two women wearing business clothes were sitting on the curb, and both of their faces were stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew was that a man had been found dead in a garage attached to this townhouse, and now he, Detective Kaplan, was heading up the investigation. So he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door, and a policeman standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more details. The victim had been identified as Don Fluitt. The two women outside were his coworkers, who had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. There were no signs of forced entry, and the women said the front door was open when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse into the living room, and right away he saw a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. Then he did a slow loop through the first and second floors and noted there was a cell phone on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter. It didn't really look like anything had been rifled through. The drawers in the house were not hanging open, and the house generally was neat and orderly. And so on first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan like a robbery. Back on the first floor, Kaplan headed into the garage, where crime scene techs were busy photographing the scene and collecting forensic samples. Kaplan knelt down next to Don's body, which was laying face up between an SUV and the back wall. Don's throat was cut with a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other, and there were smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, his ear, and on his hand, as if he had tried to fight back. There were also signs of blunt force trauma, as if he had been hit by an object like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked closely, he saw burst capillaries on Don's eyes and eyelids, which he knew were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent and gruesome, which Kaplan knew meant this was likely personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the blood that was spattered on the walls and refrigerator above Don's body, and the bloody handprints on the side of Don's truck. There was no blood on the floor around Don. However, it sort of appeared like somebody had recently mopped and maybe tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty bottle of bleach on top of the washer nearby. So he walked over, he opened up the washer, and sure enough, he found piles of wet towels inside that actually still smelled like bleach. Just then, a crime scene tech came over carrying luminol spray, which is a chemical used by law enforcement to detect blood. And so Kaplan stepped back so he could spray the area, and then Kaplan followed him around as he made his way through the house. The luminol spray did pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and the sink too, and Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage and then wash their hands or the murder weapon in the kitchen before leaving. But it is much harder to scrub a murder scene than people realize, And so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually recover some of the killer's DNA. Kaplan stepped through the front door just as a car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car and pushed past the crime scene tape, and immediately Kaplan put his hands up to stop him. This man looked totally flustered, and he introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord, and asked what the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Don Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped, then started talking a mile a minute. He said Don was a devoted father and a religious man who would open up his home to anyone and that nobody would want to kill him. But then Benny paused and made a face like something was just occurring to him. And he said that, actually, there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Don did charity work with the homeless, and he said it was possible that somebody from the street could have maybe broken into Don's house and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny, he sent him on his way, and then he just stood on Don's driveway, thinking about what Benny had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder, and the fact that nothing appeared to be stolen, he doubted very much that this had just been a break-in by a random homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Don's killer was someone Don knew, and maybe even someone who had a key, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Don was a big and muscular guy, and it was clear he had fought back with his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially big male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Don Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two co-workers who had called 911 had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan went to the house of Don's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had spoken to Christine the day before just to break the news about her ex-husband's death, and also to see what she might know about the murder. Christine hadn't had any ideas about who would have wanted to hurt Don, but she'd mentioned that he used to have a problem with road rage, and he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so maybe he had gotten into it with another driver, and maybe they had followed him home. But she also said their daughter had been with him, and she didn't mention anything about that. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had actually told her that his dog was acting skittish when he had gotten back from that road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine as a suspect because she had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at Christine's around 7:45 the night he was killed, and then she and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together. Her road rage idea seemed as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but not particularly helpful in identifying a suspect. But now Kaplan was back at Christine's house because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry, who had been out of town last night for work since he was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Don's ex-wife, he was a natural suspect. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite smile. Kaplan entered the living room, where Christine and Sienna were sitting, and said hello, and then asked them to leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in an armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed calm and friendly as he told the detective that he and Don didn't have much contact with each other, but their relationship was not exactly bad. It was just awkward because of the custody battle Don had had with Christine. Ever since then, Terry said, he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Don. He knew Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked a conflict, Sienna would likely take Don's side. As for the night of Don's murder, Terry told Kaplan he was at his sister's house until about 9 p.m., and then he left and he stopped at Wendy's on the way to work, and then he took a nap in his truck in the parking lot before going in for his shift. After Kaplan left and went back to the station, he immediately called Terry's sister and also Terry's boss, and they both confirmed Terry's whereabouts, which meant that Terry's alibi was solid, and Kaplan was back to square one on suspects. But while he was writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang with a call from one of Don's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her security camera for the night of Don's murder, and she found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence and drove right to this neighbor's house, where she led him inside, to her computer, where she pressed play. Kaplan leaned in close to the screen and watched the black and white footage of the side of Dawn's townhouse shot from the top of the driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., a few minutes after Kaplan knew that Dawn and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure tipped over Dawn's trash can and then walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn driving into the garage and then walking out again to go pick up the trash can and then walking back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light dimming, which meant the garage door was closing, but then inexplicably, the door must have begun going back up again because the light began to get bigger. And at the same time, there were several brief flashes of light, and then after the flashes, the light began to dim again, which meant the garage door closed, eventually leaving the driveway in darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video, then left the neighbor's house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what actually happened on the video. He stood inside of Dawn's garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand, and he pressed the button to close the door. And as it closed, Kaplan walked closer until he was almost directly underneath the door's path. And then, when that happened, all of a sudden, the door stopped because Kaplan had actually tripped the sensor by going right underneath it. And as soon as he tripped the sensor, a light on the top of the garage flashed 3 times as the door not only stopped, but began going back the other way. It was clearly how the system worked if it was tripped. And so once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he saw in the video, and then also that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage. And all at once, it was like the pieces clicked into place. The suspect must have followed Dawn into the garage. But when they went into the garage, perhaps they tripped the sensor, and so as that door was coming down, the suspect's trying to sneak in, they trip the sensor, the door stops, there's those flashes of light, the door begins to go up again, but the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what's going on, rushed over, hits the button, the door shuts, Dawn is none the wiser. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage appeared to be, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on this security video. But, the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They also must have known when he would leave to take Sienna to her mother's house, and when he would likely come back home. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, that he wouldn't just let it sit there. He would deal with it that night. He would go down there and he would turn it upright. And when Dawn was doing that, that would give the killer an opportunity to sneak into the garage. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn. They had to have known him very well. Detective Kaplan spent weeks speaking to everyone who knew Dawn, from coworkers to friends to his entire family, including his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad. However, they said that wasn't true of some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan the person he should be investigating was Dawn's own brother, Dennis. They said that Dawn and Dennis had had a falling out about a year earlier, but somehow, after Dawn's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Dawn's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over everything ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the family that he was just trying to help, but Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January 2017, so nearly a month after Dawn was murdered, Kaplan brought Dawn's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. And seated across the interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or irritated about it because he was innocent. Dennis said that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015. A little over a year earlier. The family had reached an agreement over what to do with their dad's possessions, but Dawn had violated that agreement by actually keeping one of their father's cars instead of selling it. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said that he and Dawn were no longer on speaking terms. Dennis said he had reached out that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Dawn never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that they could at some point patch things up, if they just tried a little bit harder, but then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Dawn was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished the explanation. He didn't really buy the reconciliation story, and Dennis's only alibi was that he was home alone when his brother was killed. So Kaplan decided to push. He asked Dennis why he'd started rooting through Dawn's house the minute the crime scene was cleared. And at this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to do that themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Dawn's affairs had actually led him to a lead about the murder that he wanted Kaplan to look into. And that was that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Dawn's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, standing inside with no good explanation for what he was doing there. Dennis said he had heard from Dawn's neighbors that Dawn and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole that the landlord was supposed to repair but hadn't yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into a crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair, remembering Benny Ruiz coming to the house on the day Dawn's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Dawn. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz into the station for an interview. Like Dawn's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Dawn was killed. But he could explain why Dennis had found him inside of Dawn's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed the dog because nobody was looking after it during the first few days following Dawn's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there were one person he should be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived, he'd been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse a few blocks away from Dawn's, and Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it so he could move some of Dawn's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this strange, and when he ran a background check on Dennis, he discovered he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no. Now, Kaplan already knew about the criminal record because he had run Dennis's name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in his brother's life. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer, but there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Dawn, as a loving father and a man of faith who had reformed himself after some mistakes in his youth, appeared to be completely accurate. Dawn's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with Dawn, over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off, and both she and her new husband Terry had alibis. Dawn also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. And so there just didn't seem to be anybody who truly wanted Dawn dead. In February, so about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article saying the police had no suspects and no evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit that it was more or less the truth. The breakthrough that Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, so 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the forensics lab, and they told him a key piece of evidence had just come in. And the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on forensic evidence, interviews, and the police investigation, here's what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of December 28, 2016. The killer waited in the darkness right outside of Dawn's house until the garage door opened at about 7:40 p.m. At that point, Dawn drove off with his daughter in the truck, and so the killer immediately darted forward and tipped over a garbage can, and then retreated back to the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Dawn for a long time. It annoyed them that everyone thought Dawn was so great. because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been this drug-abusing loser with 2 kids he didn't even care for, and another one who he deserved to lose in Siena. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it, but finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud hovering over their life constantly, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to figure out his schedule. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's that evening, and that he'd be coming home alone after that, and that before he went to bed, he would go into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand, which is a small wooden bat used to check tire pressure, and as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 p.m., Don came back, and while he was out fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind a vehicle as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed a button to close the garage door and then open the door to his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into position, and as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those lights flashing. And so thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to close the garage door. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement inside the townhouse that would suggest Don was like, "What's going on?" and coming out to check. But Don didn't seem to notice. And so the killer breathed out a sigh of relief and took their position near the door. And then after a while, the doorknob jiggled, and the killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon, and as soon as Don opened the door, they struck him so hard the tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Don again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage they'd been pushing down for so long. Don did everything he could to fight back. I mean, he had turned his life around. He had a daughter that he loved, that he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here, and so as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer. But he had been gravely injured, and when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck and hide. But the killer pulled him out and landed one last punch to his face. Don stopped moving, and at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and they squeezed. But the killer wasn't done. To make sure Don was dead, they also went into Don's apartment, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, came back into the garage, knelt down, and ruthlessly slit Don's throat. Blood ran out of the wound and poured onto the concrete. The killer found some bleach inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could, but they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Don was not able to save his own life, but by aggressively fighting back, he'd given investigators a clue that would solve his murder, and also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Siena would grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind that solved the case was DNA found under Don's fingernails that belonged to none other than Siena's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's until 9 p.m. was a lie. And so, on April 3rd, 2017, just over 3 months after Don's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with murder. After his arrest, Terry cast blame on his wife, Christine, saying she was the one who put him up to it so they could have Siena to themselves. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder, but the charges against her were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Terry, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 12 years.